Hello, my name is Jack Berner, and I'm an MA student of archaeology. I've always been interested in how an archaeologist who runs their own project in a specific region brings on and recruits various scientific experts to learn more about their study material. So I had the fortune of interviewing Denis Sharapov, who studies Bronze Age communities in Russia's southern Ural steppe. He's currently at the University of Tyumen in Russia, and he earned his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. And he's been involved in a lot of different scientific projects in this region, so I hope you enjoy hearing all about them. So, what I'm really curious about, and what I kind of really want to get a good sense of during the interview, is how scientific techniques contribute to kind of like the whole totality of research in the southern Ural steppe region and what your involvement is. So, kind of going through a whole bunch of different methodologies that you've involved yourself with or touched on. So I think we can start with like what different methodologies have you focused on in your career so far? How would you characterize yourself as a specialist? What are your specialties?
Personally, I've been using different types of techniques. Overall, my research is regional. I look at regional settlement patterns. And in doing a good regional settlement pattern analysis, I involve a lot of different specialists. Usually being in Russia, I involve local Russian specialists or specialists from the neighboring countries like Kazakhstan.
Yeah.
What I've been using, as you've probably seen in some of my publications, for example, soil chemistry analysis, is one thing that I think has a great potential in the steppes. I, of course, encountered this necessity to work with soils when I was doing a regional survey. Because to do a good regional survey, you need to understand local geomorphology. And in my particular case, I had to look at the soil accumulation rates. How fast does the soil accumulate in the steppes? How far do I need to dig to get to the cultural layers of the Bronze Age? Here I was kind of standing on the shoulders of, mostly Russian researchers that have done this analysis that's called chronosequences, when they basically look at these, soil accumulation rates for agricultural reasons, for archaeological reasons, and so forth. We have certain deposits that occur over and over again at settlements. Here I'm talking about these deposits that are called estuaries. Yeah, you've seen some of those, and not a lot of work has been done on those. Like, people see those estuaries over and over again at these late Bronze Age settlements, but what are they really? Do they actually contain a bunch of ash or not? That's one of the basic questions. So we were trying to do some chemical analysis, of those soils. We're trying to do sort of this geomorphological, soil chemistry analysis at the settlement level to outline the borders of settlements, for example, to identify settlements in terms of predictive modeling. So these are some of the ways that I've been using, for example, soil chemistry,
Practically speaking, like logistically speaking, how does that soil chemistry analysis work? How much of it is done in the field versus in a lab, and what are the actual techniques or technologies that you're using?
Yeah, the technology is X-ray fluorescence, so it's XRF analysis. We've been doing ours in Moscow. They have a stationary XRF spectrometer, so we just send our samples there. So far, it's been done in labs. And like, for example, we have one in Tyumen. Tyumen is the city where I live, Siberia. We have a stationary XRF spectrometer, but it's kind of broken right now. So it can only detect certain chemicals and not the others, which is okay because right now I'm sort of targeting phosphorus, which is a byproduct of animal and human digestion.
So Denis mentioned XRF, which stands for X-ray fluorescence. This image on the left diagrams out how XRF works. It basically shoots an X-ray beam into whatever object you're studying, and the feedback tells you, in parts per million, what elements are in the sample. So in this case, Denis is looking for phosphorus, because of this diagram on the right. Human and animal activity adds a lot of phosphorus to the soil through waste and decomposition.
So this is sort of the marker element, for us to identify the borders of the settlement. And I will be able to do it here in Tyumen or in Moscow, so I have some options. So it's sometimes we almost have to start with the availability of the methods, with the availability of the equipment,
Right.
and let that, in a way, guide our research questions.
Right. Yeah, that actually leads me to another question, which is kind of a fun one. But if you did have access to, unlimited funding, or there was no concern about any sort of limitations based on funding, access to certain technologies that might be hard to get a hold of, what directions would you want to take?
Yeah, one thing that definitely comes to mind is geophysics, magnetometers. We need an up-to-date magnetometer.
Magnetometers do exactly what you'd think. They measure magnetism in the form of magnetic fields. Here on the left, an archaeologist is using one that he's basically just moving over the landscape, hoping to find magnetic anomalies in the soil. Certain types of burned soil and rocks, and of course metals, are especially easy to detect.
So that would be great for these sites, both for burials and for settlements, because not a lot of them have been inspected sort of in mass. But it's not only about the equipment, but also about the specialists. I want to involve the specialists also who really know how to use that equipment and who have the experience.
Right.
So I would love, for some big names in whatever kind of specialty to get involved on my project.
I mean, this is a Bronze Age society, Bronze Age communities you're dealing with. I assume you've dealt with bronze objects and in production waste like slag, and I saw that you co-authored a paper on Sintashta period slag. So I'm wondering what sort of lab work that involved. I assume you involved a specialist.
So the specialist that I've involved, his name is Dr. Ankushev. He's about my age. He's a starting out researcher, but he's been using, X-ray fluorescence, of course, like XRF, to look at the chemical composition of not only the slag. His big thing is he's trying to find the sources, the mines. So we find these slags, we find these bronze objects, but where were the mines, and how was this process organized? The whole chain of production. And in his search for the sources of the copper ore, you need to have the potential sources. Sort of, that's the problem. To pinpoint the sources, you need to get samples from the potential sources. So it's sort of like you need to know the sources to find the sources.
Right. Yeah.
And there are some potential ones. Besides XRF, he's used crystallography and also spectroscopy. They look not only at the chemical composition, but through microscopes, they look at the actual structure of different crystals, of different, chemical compounds.
Slag is the waste you get from smelting metals, from ores that come from mines into more pure metal forms. You can look at slags and metal artifacts under very powerful optical microscopes or electron microscopes to learn about their microscopic structure, which can reveal details about the technological choices involved in their production. So hammered metals look different than cast metals under a microscope, and different heating temperatures look different as well.
The next task for him was to see, with the heat treatment, what are the chemical compounds that do not change? So as we heat this ore to great temperatures, much of its composition just changes. But there are certain compounds, chromospinelity is what they're called in Russian. Chromospinelids maybe is what you call them in English. I'm not sure. That those compounds, they do not actually change with temperature. So he's been able to, with more or less certainty, to identify those potential mines.
What is identifying the various sources of copper, whether it's small pit mines or just minerals on the surface, tell you about the organization of these communities?
For those applications, I need to sort of finish my survey, to look at these local communities and look whether there was a sort of level of craft specialization at the level of local communities or not. And it's not that difficult to do, if we find a bunch of slag in one small village and we find no slag in another small village.
Right.
And so to turn it into this anthropological kind of analysis that we're used to in the West, it will take a good quality settlement pattern study.
I also saw a paper of yours talking about the consumption of fish in Shintashta communities. So I was wondering what prompted you to study that, and how did you carry out that research, and briefly, what were your results?
If you look at the recent articles in the Eurasian steppes, it's like a stable isotope kind of trend, that's definitely going on right now. For example, I'll speak for Russia in particular. Local archaeologists, they act as sort of donors. What they do is they donate the materials to the Western archaeologists. And then Western archaeologists analyze those materials with these high-cost laboratory sort of archaeometry methods, like staple isotopes and et cetera, et cetera. So the results are that they find anomalously high levels of nitrogen in the bones of Bronze Age populations. And so the question is why? And the only candidate that these people could come up with so far is that they consumed quite a bit of fish, which is kind of surprising because we're talking about the Eurasian steppes. It's an arid region. These sites, none of them are located along big rivers. And so my 10 cents was that let's look at the reality. Maybe some other source of food is causing this high nitrogen value that we see. Because what I have done is that in collaboration with a local ichthyologist, which is like a fish specialist, we've calculated how much fish could this area produce possibly. We looked at these rivers, and these are the least fish abundant areas in this area. It's like, these people, if fish was a primary component of their diet, they picked the wrong spot. And so what I'm suggesting is maybe some other source of diet caused these high nitrogen levels, and I'm suggesting maybe it's some plant component that they grew in the sort of floodplains of these small rivers, possibly, because some plants, naturally occurring plants that grow right next to these rivers, they have high nitrogen.
So are there any future lines of research for this?
In the future, of course, the whole botanical aspect, the plant component of the diet is a big mystery in the steppes, because these people lived sort of sedentary or at least semi-sedentary. We see permanent settlements, we see pretty large populations by the steppe standards, but we don't see any plant component of their diet yet.
Yeah, as you know, I'm interested in physical geography personally, and the techniques that you use in that field, like involving UAVs and satellite images and things like that. So I was just wondering if you could briefly talk about your exposure to that and how that's figured into your overall research.
Yeah, great question. That's something that I'm working on right now. And, here in Russia, quite often we need to start with the basics, which is not bad, because through the basics you get this foundation that you then can build on. For example, we don't have a good topography of my survey area. It seems like a very basic kind of task, but we're working on that, on just creating a good detailed topographic plan of our survey area. And it turns out it's not that simple. What I'm trying to do right now is to model flooding. Again, that's something surprising for the steppes. These are arid regions, small rivers, but we are talking about flooding, seasonal flooding. And the way these sites are located is very smart. These people, they were very intelligent. They knew their environment very, very well. And they built their sites exactly on these sort of small terraces that are elevated above the floodplain just a little bit, just enough not to get flooded. But some sites were not. And that's kind of interesting. The sites that were not, were they seasonal sites, right? That maybe were these settlements that were founded in these areas that got flooded seasonally and therefore had great pastures. And, we will be using the UAV, we will be using the total station and see how the sites fit into that flood modeling, because we know by how much the river usually rises in these steppe rivers, not only seasonally, but also there are episodic bad floods, every once in a while, like every 12 years, every 15 years, where it's just out of control. And we, in one of our field seasons, sort of got caught in one of those floods. And it got a lot of us thinking about this type of analysis, and we need to address this question of how much the flood or the avoidance of floods dictated or predicted, the location of these settlements.
Right, perfect. I think that's a great overall summary of the sort of scientific research that you're conducting in your region. So I'd like to thank you. That was a great interview. Thanks for your time.
Okay. Thanks for having me, Jack.